I was being a bit ridiculous. Thank you for pointing that out.
This is the One Accord Podcast, and we're continuing in our biblical theology project, and on today's slate for discussion is Exodus chapters 3 and 4. And as always, I've got Greg and Eric with me. How you guys doing today, Eric? Anything new or exciting in your world?
A lot, and not enough time to talk about all of it, but just very exciting stuff. Got some good evangelistic events coming up, and I'm excited to share the gospel and today dive into the Bible.
Amen. Well, praise the Lord. I'm excited to talk about these chapters with you, Greg. Anything new or exciting with you? Nothing out of the ordinary or too much to talk about? Somewhere in between?
No, I have too little to talk about, so you probably shouldn't ask. I'm noticing now that I'm the only one not wearing a collared shirt, so I'm feeling kind of grungy as I look at you well-dressed gentlemen. So
I think you look good. So
thanks.
Anyway,
I appreciate the lies.
Well, it's good to see you guys, and why don't we, without further ado, just get right into it since there is so much to get to. So on to Exodus 3.
Now Moses was pasturing the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of a bush, and he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not consumed. So Moses said, I must turn aside now and see this marvelous sight, why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near here. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He said also, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Then Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their sufferings. So I have come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from the land to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanite, and the Hittite, and the Amorite, and the Perizzite, and the Hivite, and the Jebusite. Now behold, the cry of the sons of Israel has come to me. Furthermore, I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians are oppressing them. Therefore come now, and I will send you to Pharaoh, so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, and that I should bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt? And he said, Certainly I will be with you, and this shall be the sign to you, that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God at this mountain. Then Moses said to God, Behold, I am going to the sons of Israel, and I will say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you. Now they may say to me, What is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, Thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, I am has sent me to you. God furthermore said to Moses, Thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial name to all generations. Go and gather the elders of Israel together, and say to them, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I am indeed concerned about you, and what has been done to you in Egypt. So I said, I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanite, and the Hittite, and the Amorite, and the Perizzite, and the Hivite, and the Jebusite, to a land flowing with milk and honey. They will pay heed to what you say, and you with the elders of Israel will come to the king of Egypt, and you will say to him, The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. So now, please, let us go a 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not permit you to go except under compulsion. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my miracles, which I shall do in the midst of it, and after that he will let you go. I will grant this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and it shall be that when you go, you will not go empty-handed. But every woman shall ask of her neighbor and the woman who lives in her house articles of silver and articles of gold, and clothing, and you will put them on your sons and daughters. Thus you will plunder the Egyptians.
Well, as this chapter begins, it says that the angel of the Lord appears to Moses as fire burning in the midst of this bush. How do you guys understand this appearance? Is this a theophany or something else?
Yeah, I think I've always understood it as a theophany, and not necessarily based upon the angel of the Lord, but more about what's being said to Moses. Don't come near here. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place which you're standing is holy ground. As I read this, you know, the holiness that's imparted by this presence, I ascribe to the holiness of God and not to some angel. That's as odd as it may seem. That's where I've always fallen.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. And earlier in Genesis 15:17, God used a flaming torch to represent himself. At least that's one common interpretation. And here he appears in a blazing fire. So it's not all that surprising that God would appear this way. So I'm going to do a little bit of speculating. Because fire is powerful and destructive, God may have used it to represent his coming judgment on the Egyptians, which he mentions here. But because the bush was not consumed by the fire, some think that it may have represented Israel suffering under Egyptian oppression without being consumed. So it's possible that God used the burning bush in a symbolic kind of way, just like he used the flaming torch in a symbolic way in Genesis 15. But as I said before, I'm doing a little bit of speculating here, but these are some interpretations that I've heard before.
I don't know that I've ever heard anybody try to draw back this presence of God as a representation of Israel, so I'd never heard that before.
It's been done, but it's, again, can it be proven that that's what it means? No. It's just, it fits with the rest of what is said in the chapter about Israel's oppression and things. But again, there might not be a link there.
Something that I've heard discussed a lot more about theology in general is the identity of this, quote unquote, the angel of the Lord as compared to an angel of the Lord. And Greg, I appreciate you planting your flag, saying you view this as a theophany. I'm curious as to what both of you would say. Some would call this a Christophany. Some people read the angel of the Lord as being pre-incarnate appearances of Christ. And I guess I'd be curious whether one or either of you take that particular view, if you think there is a difference with significance between theophanies and Christophanies, and whether you would accept both as possible, or would you accept one and reject the other. That's fairly open-ended, but I know there's a lot of discussion about that. And so now we have kind of one of these primary passages, and we'll most likely see the angel of the Lord again. And so it's good to be kind of at least building a foundation from, as we go. So any thoughts on that? Theophany, yes. Christophany, also yes. Christophany, no. What thoughts or perspective do you have on that?
I guess I've never even considered it being a Christophany, and that's odd, right? Because once you start talking about a human pre-incarnate manifestation of Christ, if you take him outside of the human manifestation, what's going to regulate what is or isn't a Christophany, right? So we for instance, we could talk about this because we have looked at in the Bible. When God comes to talk to Abraham, he comes in the form of a man, but the Lord is ascribed to this individual. And so there, I guess I would feel a little bit more comfortable venturing out and planting my flag on a Christophany, because here it is a person, whereas this is a bush. So I guess traditionally I would stick with theophany rather than Christophany.
The angel of the Lord is in the midst of the bush.
Yeah, I know he's in the midst of the bush,
okay.
but
he didn't appear as a bush. The bush was there. He appeared in the midst of the bush as a fire, and then it didn't consume.
I was being a bit ridiculous. Thank you for pointing that out.
All right.
The people that say like all these things are Christophanies, I would just say that they have the burden of proof. If you're going to make the case that this is Christ specifically, then you'd have to make some argument.
By what standard, right?
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess I wonder, like, what is the value of even making a claim like that if there's nothing?
Well, there's always a desire to want to see Christ in the Old Testament, right? I think the three of us are guys that would want to prove a continuity between testaments, and so I can. While I don't agree with it, I can at least sympathize with the desire in this case.
Well, I think you can do that plenty,
Well, sure.
but
Yeah.
not but without making assumptions. And I can't because of the format of this show. There are several that come to my mind that I can't get into right now. But I think you can. What you just said, I think is totally valid, but I think you can do that without making these different assumptions.
No, I completely agree. All I was saying is, like, I mean, how easy is it for us to want to start proving our case, and we pick a proof text here and a proof text there that, well, is it really? We all fall into that trap. Or
quit
at
doing
least
that,
if you haven't, Eric, you are a once again better man than me. So
I've done it before.
That's exactly the point, is that, when we want something to be there, we can selectively read it in, and eisegesis is bad no matter who's doing it, and that includes when we're doing it. So, Eric, I think your point is very well said. Anybody who would want to claim that, they bear the burden of proof. I see nothing, at least in this text, that suggests that this is a Christophany necessarily, although I do share that desire. Yeah, of course, I want to see the continuity between the Old and New Testament. But I have zero desire to shoehorn Jesus into passages that he doesn't belong in. That just seems to be such bad exegetical method that I have zero interest in that. And I think it often makes us look silly, especially to others who look at the text and go, I mean, you guys are just saying this says whatever. Those are speculations that I'm not.
But at the same time, in a different sense, I want to say that, like, Jesus is fully in accord with whatever God is saying here. Like, Jesus isn't not yet existent or separated from, and so in a sense, Jesus is here, like I can't reference that passage
Jesus.
either.
We haven't read about anybody named Jesus yet.
So we can make all those cases when we get to those texts. But here we see the angel of the Lord, and then we hear God is speaking to Moses. And so whether or not the angel of the Lord is God speaking, or an emissary of God, or if God is just speaking and this other manifestation is going on, these are all valid questions to ask, and we probably won't answer all of those. But again, I appreciate you guys sharing your thoughts. Let's move on. Moses at least begins initially interested in what he sees, and then he becomes afraid. Why does his interest move to fear in this passage?
Eric, go ahead.
Well, we read earlier that the Hebrew midwives feared God. We read that in Exodus 1:17. Moses might have had the same fear. When God spoke to him from the bush, he told him not to come near because the place was holy. And I guess I want to just say this one thing about that phrase, because the word holy is actually kind of it's a scary word in a sense, because if a place is holy, you don't treat it lightly. So when God spoke to Moses from the bush and he told him not to come near because the place was holy, this actually could have been interpreted as a threat. God might have been saying, if you get too close, I'm going to have to kill you because you're unholy and I'm holy. And that would be cause to be afraid. So that's another possibility. The word holy, it can mean stay away or you're going to die. So that's one way to look at it.
Yeah. I think I would be in general agreement there. What I find interesting here, in the same conversation that Moses has to ask, like, who are you? Like, what's your name? Who should I tell has sent me? Which reveals a certain level of ignorance or lack of knowledge. At the same time, to me, as I read here, he has enough respect for, knowledge of God's holiness so as to be afraid, at least as I read the text. So yes, I view this, as you do, a response to God's overwhelming holiness, his separateness, set apartness.
Well, that raises another interesting point, and so last week we talked about, as we were talking about chapters 1 and 2, about how the midwives feared the Lord, and we're bringing that up again, rightfully so, as we see this. Greg, it is possible to read this part as, when he's asking for a name, perhaps as revealing ignorance. It is also possible, I think, to read this as Moses, because if they have some knowledge of who God is, that they are supposed to worship the true and living God who brought them into this land or brought their ancestors into this land, and they're supposed to reject the gods of Egypt. As this conversation is going on, he says, okay, who are you, so that I can tell them, so that they'll also want to follow. that could be ignorance, but it also could be because of specificity. They actually know, well, we're only listening to one God. So whatever is going on with this, burning spectacle, and whoever it is that is speaking to me, how can I make sure that I'm communicating to them that it's the God that we're supposed to be following? That's another way to possibly read this, I suppose. So what does the asking of this name mean, I guess, is another question that we wanted to discuss briefly.
Yeah, well, I guess I wanted to point out the fact that while we have been seeing in our Bibles the Lord, or the covenant name Yahweh, this is the first time that it's actually revealed. Like, as I understand the history of this text being developed, every place that we've seen this up to now has been Moses applying that name as he's writing Genesis and Exodus. So there is truly yes to what you're saying, very possibly, but there is still a lack of this name really being present for the people to call on. Right?
Well, what is the memorial name?
What is the memorial name? Sure. Yeah. As I read the text, the memorial name is Yahweh, or I am.
Okay, well, so the Yod He Vav He is not exactly the same as the I am. These are technically different. Just so he was revealed as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as God Almighty, El Roy, and these other names from before. Those aren't necessarily exactly the same name. The I am who I am is different than the Yod He Vav He or the Tetragrammaton or whatever. And so it is possible that he's revealing the memorial name Yod He Vav He, but then he's also referring to a name that they would have known when he says, "Tell them that I am sent you." That's possible. Again, I'm not necessarily drawing that conclusion. I'm just suggesting.
But we haven't seen that revealed, at least, right?
Sure.
So maybe he's giving that to somebody else.
Yeah,
but
there has been
seems like we would have gotten that, but maybe
and it's curious to ask, like, okay, when we get things that are revealed, are we being told everything that they know? Like, as we're reading through this, well, I think we asked the question before, like, did Abraham know more about God than we give him credit for, or did Noah know more about God than we give him credit for? Like, there doesn't seem to be a real effort of Moses as he's writing this to give us some sort of exhaustive behind the scenes knowledge of this is everything that they knew about the Lord. I think it's very possible that these men who are walking with God and these women who are walking with God knew him better than we might anticipate. Like, just because we haven't gotten this information, Adam walked with God. I feel like he probably would have learned an awful lot about God during that time. And those things could have been passed down from generation to generation. I don't think that that's insane to think. Same thing with Noah. Noah walked with the Lord. That phrase seems like Noah would have had an awful lot of intimate understanding of who God is that he would have passed down to his descendants. And could Shem, and through that line, through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, have orally passed down a lot more information about God than we saw revealed as it was written. Again, I hold that as a possibility. I'm not demanding it or requiring it. So
I accept that it's a possibility. If that is the case, it doesn't seem odd that he'd say, "Well, I am who I am," but to go on and say, "This is my name forever." Well, if they already know that, then, like, if you're just clearing up the misunderstanding between, is this God or is this Ra or whatever other false deity there is, does there need to be the declaration that he goes on to make in verse 15? Maybe.
I'm suggesting a possibility that if 14 and 15 are different, that he's referring in a way that they would have known. Say, "Tell them I am sent me," or "sent you," which is something that they would have said, "Oh, okay, this is the God that we're supposed to be listening to." And then verse 15 is new information, that is a different name that they didn't know previously. And that's the one, the Hebrew, where you rightly said that Moses changed, the Lord in all caps, which again, we'll talk about in a second. That is the verse 15 one, not necessarily the verse 14.
Verse 14.
Again,
Okay.
they're different words in both the Hebrew and the Greek. So,
gotcha. Okay.
Eric, you got any thoughts on this?
I've assumed that the name that's revealed was something they didn't know. I kind of thought it was new revelation. They knew. I'm sure it sounds like they knew God as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and maybe not anything really beyond that. But they did know about God's character, and we know that from other texts that we've read. So how much exactly they knew is really hard to say.
It is. It's difficult to speculate, and so, like I said, it is one possible way of reading this is that verse 14 and verse 15 are all new information. Another way of reading is that verse 14 is, suppose they ask me what's his name. If we take God out of it for a second, and somebody that you are surprised to meet comes to you and tries to give you a task and wants you to go lead some people, and you say, well, what if these people ask your name? What am I supposed to tell them? If they don't know your name, then whatever you say doesn't matter. If it's some new name, like suppose they ask his name, I could say anything I want. Whereas if you say, well, suppose they ask me what's the name of this God, if I say the name that they're aware of, that seems like that would give them some comfort. That at least makes sense to me. Whereas if you say, well, what's his name? It was Gus or Bill or something like, oh yeah, well, we never knew it. So, okay, thanks for telling us his name that we never knew. And I don't know how that would be a test of saying, oh, well, God said to do this. Well, what's his name? It's this. Oh yeah, okay. We've never heard that before, but we go with you. So there is a possibility of just saying that verse 14 is information that they would have had some familiarity with. In verse 15, the memorial name, that is the new information. And again, I at least submit that for your consideration.
I guess I can see that as a possibility.
It's not impossible. I just wonder why no one had mentioned this prior. Like, to me, it just seems like someone, at least once, would have possibly mentioned this before. But again, we only have so much information to work with. So
arguing from silence is always difficult. There's so much that hasn't been said already that, there's, as we are getting it in Revelation, none of us would think that every conversation or all the knowledge has been meticulously detailed.
True.
We've gotten what we need, not necessarily what we want. Sorry, Greg, you were about to say something.
Yeah. And don't hear this as an argument either way, but what we've read so far in our Bible was recorded after the events, right? Like this wasn't being transcribed in time. So it's curious to me if that name was present, why that wouldn't have been recorded as part of the story leading us to here, so that we were going, yes, for sure. We know that God, we know him as I am, because we've been introduced to him as I am. And so, as part of a narrative story, as I read this, it seems like a revelation to me. But again, I could be.
No, that's a very fair point. And so
it's a good argument.
Yeah. So in verse 11, and this wasn't on our sheet, so I apologize, but as we were reading through it again, it just kind of popped out to me. God said that you would know this by this sign, that you would worship at this mountain. It's like a sign after the fact. You guys ever think about that? Oftentimes you get a sign beforehand saying this is how you can know that this will come to pass. But this is saying, at least maybe I'm misreading it, but if you read it the same, is it interesting that he says, well, how will I know this is going to come true? Well, do all this difficult stuff. Go and confront Pharaoh and lead the people out. And this is how you'll know that you'll worship at this mountain.
Yeah, no, that is interesting. And again, it's laying an obligation of faith upon Moses that we've seen a clear expectation up till now. And so, yay that.
That's true, but on the other hand, it's also true that prior to them worshiping on the mountain, God was going to do miracles that had never been done before in front of millions of people, proving that He was the one true God, and that the gods of Egypt were nothing. So I mean, it's not like God gave them nothing to work with, and then said, "Well, the sign will be after the fact." I mean, He is promising here, "I'm going to give you an overwhelming amount to work with, and then the final sign, at least that's the way I see it, is you're going to be worshiping at the mountain."
Yeah, but it is interesting though that this comes before all the other things, right?
True, that is true. That's an interesting point. I hadn't really thought much about that.
Well, this might be laying a foundation, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the name. But knowing the name of the Lord is more than just about information. It's also about knowing His character, knowing His activity. And so we get kind of this revelation of a sign, and then this name, and then you will know by the fact that it all goes exactly the way that I said. And so I want us to keep that in mind, that there are, the Bible has been showing us that there are certain people who kind of have some sort of head knowledge about, maybe there is a creator, maybe there is a God or something like that. Maybe He wants us to do certain things and not do other things. And then there's those who actually walk with the Lord and know Him in a different sense, know Him experientially, know Him in the fact that they serve Him as their God and they are His people. And so a sign after the fact is saying, then, you'll know because I'm telling you in advance. I've told you who I am. Everything's going to go the way I say. You'll be here. You'll worship me, and you'll know. It's kind of a weighty statement, I think, about that. But it does take a little bit of faith. And certainly there is a sign, this bush that's miraculously burning and not being consumed. And there's a greater sign to come, which, again, like Eric, like you said, that they'll see even more. So pretty interesting stuff. Let's talk more about that name. And I sorry to back us up and then bring us back to it. But this name that is revealed, it's supposed to be for every generation. And then, Greg, you already mentioned it. Most of our modern English translations do not preserve that name. They actually translate it out. If you're reading an English Bible, most translations, they'll print the name as Lord instead in all caps, and that is a replacement of the divine name. Is that the right thing to do? Does that make you uncomfortable at all? Should we have kept that name? I know that there are some groups that are very adamant. And of course, there's debate whether it's Yahweh or Jehovah is the proper pronunciation, but there are certain groups that really make a big deal about this name being removed. Should it have been removed? Should we make a big deal about that? Again, a fairly broad question, but Greg, what thoughts do you have about that?
Yeah, sure. I'm probably going to fall in the camp of the extremists or the radicals here. I find absolutely no reason why we should have done this. If my historical understanding, or if my understanding of the historical events that led to this, it was out of fear of blaspheming or offending God that we went ahead and erased his name and wrote in what we decided would be better here. That seems foolish to me. If we decided that Jesus's name was too holy, do we just get to erase it and Bill? That way we can't offend Jesus because by using his name incorrectly, because we're now calling him Bill. Well, I don't know. Have you ever considered maybe he's offended by being called Bill instead of the name he told you to call him by? Of course, that's even, as I say this, that's even funny, right? Like, Jesus wasn't the name that was used, Yeshua or Jesus in the Greek. And so, how much freedom do we have to change names? Now, with Jesus, it's translating it into English. Here, this is a different title. It's a title instead of a name. First of all, the Lord. So yeah, I as personally now when I'm reading the Bible out loud at church, if I'm preaching or whatnot, I'll use the Lord most of the time. But as I read the Bible, I'm erasing that and putting Yahweh in its place as I read for myself.
The fact that God is called Lord in Hebrew, Adonai, that's the term that was substituted for the divine name, is slightly different than substituting Bill or a different personal name.
You're gonna catch me on every exaggeration I do.
Well, but I think it's fair. So your point is well taken, but it is again slightly different. So
you're
Eric,
gonna be a stickler today.
How that's my role here, Greg. Eric, how do you view this? Do you view it the same as Greg? You got different thoughts?
Well, I think if God says this is my name, and that name is used in Scripture over and over again, I think it should be translated as it is. Now, having said that, I personally, and this is just my own personal opinion, I don't know that this is as important today as it was then. And the only reason I say that is because back then, even in this particular story that we're reading, there's all these different gods. They have all these different names. All the gods had a name. And there was so many to sift through. There's so many to choose from. And so for God to give his specific name here, I think is really important because it allowed Israel to differentiate between him and other gods. And even, Israel, let's just say they didn't always worship the one true God. So knowing God's name was important, but also knowing who God was just as important. And his name revealed who he was. God is the eternal, self-existent one. God is not a created being. God God transcends everything. So I think that there's certainly advantages to knowing God's name. more for them probably than it is for us, simply because we live in a culture that's been greatly influenced by Christianity. And so when I say the word God in America, 99% of the people that I say that to are going to assume I mean the God of the Bible.
Yeah, except we just had a guy sworn into one of the highest offices in the land using the a Hindu text. So,
true.
I think
that's why I said 99%, not 100%.
I think we made this argument 100 years ago in America. I think we'd have a little bit firmer ground to stand on. I'm not convinced that's the case, and I don't want to use whatever's happening in my culture to justify how we translate the Bible.
I'm not talking about translation. I'm just
it is translation, right? The Hebrew text does not have the Lord, all capital letters, anywhere in. That's not what the prophets wrote. That's not what Moses wrote. That's not what was written. And so we have translated this differently, knowingly. Like it's not even a secret. The original text does not have the Lord as the in it, or I mean, again, yes, is he called the Lord Adonai? Yes, but this is a different word that we've chosen to translate incorrectly, for a host of reasons that might be good or might not be good.
No, and I'm agreeing with that. I think that when we're talking about Bible translation, I think you should translate it for what it is. If it's God's name, you should translate it that way. But I'm talking about when we're just talking to people out in the street, and I say God. Now there have been some times where there was one guy I was talking to not long ago, and we were talking about God. He says, "Yeah, I believe in Allah," and I'm like,
"Sure, exactly."
But I'm like, but I'm not. That's not who I'm talking about. I'm talking about Yahweh.
So isn't it? Don't you consider? In my personal opinion, I'm not going to ask you the question. I consider it a tragedy that you can't. That if you walked up and said, "Do you know Yahweh?" They'd be like, "Do what now? Who? Why doesn't our God have? Why don't we represent our God with the name that He gave us rather than just God or just Lord?" Now I agree. He has those titles as well, but those are titles. But this is a name. It's a title and a name. Like I don't call you evangelist when we talk. Hey, evangelist, how you doing? You're Eric, right? Or pastor. Now some people do that with pastor. Silly too. I just don't. I cannot drum up a legitimate reason in my mind to not use his name.
That's true, but I also want to avoid another extreme, and the other extreme is, like, I've heard people say, well, if you pray and you don't use God's name, He doesn't know who you're talking to. Okay, that's a dumb argument, and I'm just going to be blunt. That argument is dumb, and actually, I would even say,
say, do you know who you are talking to? Not a problem with God's knowledge.
I was going to say exactly that same thing.
I will agree with that argument.
When you say Yahweh, who do you mean?
For sure.
Yeah, so I want to avoid, and you're not taking the extreme.
And I'm not trying to take a legalistic position either.
No, I know.
Like this is he's told us his name, and we go, yeah. No thanks. We're going to do something better, different.
Sure, that's a valid argument.
I think many people have no problem saying Jesus if we're talking about Christians, right? And so Jesus is the name that has been revealed as God in the New Testament and this second person of the Trinitarian understanding, right? People have a lot more comfort with that, although there are many people who don't even think we should say his name, or the issue that you brought up, Greg, of, is it Yeshua or should we say Jesus or whatever? We can talk about that at a different time. I do share your, I think you use the word tragedy, that people don't really know the name of the Lord. And you keep using Yahweh. What would you say to someone who says that God's name is Jehovah, that you're even saying it wrong? I mean, the difficulty is because this happened, right or wrong, it's not necessarily a mistranslation. I understand what you're saying. The culture, because they stopped saying the name of the Lord and they said Adonai, it's because of the reverence for what we received. We have this text from the Masoretes. They put the vowel pointing in. They have the what is written and what was spoken, and they had stopped saying it. And so, the translators were rightly translating this received tradition, and by noting it that way, they're showing us, okay, this is what is read, but what is meant or what is actually there is the name of the Lord. And so your personal practice of you actually personally substituting that is they're showing you that, and they are translating that in a way that is preserving what we've received intact. And so I understand why they've done it. But how do you know that you're substituting the correct name? Because it wasn't pronounced. And how do you know that those who'd say Jehovah, that they say, well, yeah, it is a tragedy, but Jehovah's his name, and we ought to be telling people the name of Jehovah.
Yeah. And again, unless all of my historical or my research into the history of that is incorrect, and maybe I am, and Lord, please open my eyes to that. It's my understanding that Jehovah was taking all the vowel points from Adonai, squishing those in where they fit, and now coming up with a new name. The Tetragrammaton, as best as it can be reconstructed, the vowels that belong there would produce the sound Yahweh, not Jehovah. Again, vowel points knowingly taken from another word, squished into the Tetragrammaton to make a different word that we get Jehovah from, is my understanding. And if that's incorrect, I would please, in the comment section below, point me to some legitimate, reputable source where I can be corrected.
If God gives us information about him, I don't think we should change it. And I appreciate the difficulty of translational work. I wouldn't go so strong as to say it's a mistranslation. I understand why they did what they did. And yet at the same time, Greg, my practice is similar to yours. When I'm reading through the Old Testament, I substitute most of the time all caps Lord for what I believe to be the
how
right.
How old were you, or how far into your walk with Christ were you before you even became aware of Yahweh as a name rather than the Lord?
I learned about it in seminary. So I went to seminary pretty soon after I got saved, but probably within the first 5 years of my walk. So how about for you?
Yeah, I would guess I was probably 5, 6, 7 years. And, for the most part, I could tell you that in the churches that I've sat in, this name has been enunciated maybe once a year, maybe twice a year. It's just not a thing that's talked about. And so why would we want to abandon something that God gave it to us? It seems important to me, especially something as important as his name.
Yeah. How about you, Eric?
I don't remember exactly. I mean, within the first, I would say, few years.
Isn't that odd that you don't know God's name for the first few years of following God?
Well, we don't know this name, but it is the weight and significance of this name as we're reading it here is, this is my memorial name to all generations forever. I mean, it does seem very significant. Of course, we're all aware of other names of God, and so, but you're right. I mean, your point is well taken. We sing a few songs that have this, Yahweh, that preserve that name, and we sing to Yahweh. I made a very unpopular decision many years ago to stop singing songs that use the name Jehovah. For similar reason of what you said before, I wouldn't sing any songs that say there's no God like Bill. We wouldn't sing that, and Jehovah to me seems more like that Bill example that you were bringing up than anything else. It's just a name that mistakenly was made up, but because of its cultural significance and how many people have grown up, they didn't learn Yahweh, but they did learn Jehovah, and they've learned Jehovah Jireh, and all these other names that have that Jehovah term. It almost seems blasphemous to some people to remove that for similar reasons to what you're stating, but in the opposite direction. They're like, how dare we get rid of God's name? And that's what they've learned God's name. They've called him by this name, which to me seems to be an error. But again, that is very offensive to some people. And I understand that would be the case. So we should be very careful with God's name, which is why they stopped saying it in the first place, because they didn't want to blaspheme it. And then now we're at this point in history dealing with the aftermath of that decision, where now there's this controversy that his name has at least partially been forgotten. You guys got anything else to add on that? I'm sure we could talk about this a lot more, but just for the sake of time, we probably should move on. But Eric, you're shaking your head. Greg, you got anything else to add?
No, I'm good.
All right. Let's talk about verses 19 to 20. Any additional conversation to be had regarding God's maybe foreknowledge based on these verses here in 19 and 20 in chapter 3?
Yeah, I mean, I guess as I read this, I just thought that God knew Pharaoh's heart, and therefore he knew how Pharaoh would respond in certain situations. Actually, God said that in verse 19. He said, but I know that the king of Egypt will not permit you to go except under compulsion. So God had a perfect knowledge of Pharaoh's heart. This isn't necessarily, I believe God has foreknowledge, of course. We've already talked about that. But I don't know that this is really so much talking about foreknowledge as it is just God's present knowledge of Pharaoh's heart. And because he knew Pharaoh so well, he knew how Pharaoh would respond in any situation. So I guess that's the way I look at it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, even going beyond verses 19 and 20, if we went to 21, I will grant this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. So here is not only knowledge, but an active influence upon people's dispositions, and not the Jewish people's dispositions, but rather the Egyptian. So the Egyptian, I am going to arrange things. I'm going to set things so that these people look at you favorably, so much as to the extent that you're going to walk out with gold and silver and clothes, and you're going to ransack them, not against their will, but they're going to happily support you doing that. So,
I mean, it's fair to say God, because of his exhaustive knowledge of at least the very present tense, that he knows exactly what's going to happen as everything unfolds, that he can be 100% confident. He's not guessing. He won't be wrong. He will be able to bring about the means that he has described, whether it's through exerting influence, of course, doing all the activities that he's planning to do. So would you guys add anything to that or take anything away from that? I mean, he's that does speak to foreknowledge, even if it is simply based on an exhaustive current present knowledge. He is so able to extrapolate that into the future that he's not wrong, and we'll see that it will unfold exactly as he said.
I think you used the word right, extrapolate. I think that's in this case. I think, in other words, I don't see God looking into the future going, "Oh, so that's what Pharaoh's going to do." I'll write that down. I think he, as more so, it was he knew, he said, "I know Pharaoh's heart, and I know what he'll do, and I put him in the situation." And so, yeah, I just think it's interesting. It's interesting to think about how he knew. But I do, just for the record, I've said this several times, I do believe God has exhaustive foreknowledge. So leave it at that.
Well, we'll talk in chapter 4, which we'll get to in just a moment here. We'll talk a little bit more about even the influence that God is able to continue to exert in order to bring about the ends that he has described. Let's move on to the last question or issue in this chapter before we get to chapter 4. But Greg, you had mentioned that you've heard at least some professing Christians before use the end of chapter 3 as an argument for reparations.
I have. Yeah.
Is that a good argument? Is that something that's persuaded you? And any other thoughts or commentary you'd like to provide on that view that you've heard?
It's persuaded me that they ought not be teaching the Bible. Is what's persuaded me. I find this argument, and again, I don't know how popular it is. I've surely heard it, that, hey, listen, the Israelites were enslaved to Egypt, and so this is an example of them being paid back, having reparations for that enslavement. And I find that hilarious, because all this gold, all the silver, all the clothes, this eventually gets turned into melted down and turned into items for the temple, and the construction, or the temple, the tabernacle, and the construction of all the stuff around that. And so I find this hilarious that instead of being given to them for their own purposes, their own uses, and their own benefits, it turns around and gets turned into a way to worship God rather than being reparations. So
that's a great point. I didn't say it because I didn't want to get a demerit, but I think the point was excellent.
I'll take my demerit. Thank you very much.
No, it's
a badge of pride. It's a badge of pride at this point. So
it was an excellent point that disproves their view completely anyway. But I've never thought of this as reparations because it wasn't. But even if it was, Israel received them right after they were freed, and they received them from the same people who enslaved them. So they didn't receive reparations hundreds of years later from people who had nothing to do with the slavery of their ancestors. So I think I would just say that using this as an argument for reparations is eisegesis on steroids.
Eisegesis on steroids. Well, that's a good point to end on. Let's dive into chapter 4. Then Moses said, "What if they will not believe me or listen to what I say? For they may say, 'The Lord has not appeared to you.'" The Lord said to him, "What is that in your hand?" And he said, "A staff." Then he said, "Throw it on the ground." So he threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent, and Moses fled from it. But the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand and grasp it by its tail." So he stretched out his hand and caught it, and it became a staff in his hand, that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has appeared to you. The Lord furthermore said to him, "Now put your hand into your bosom." So he put his hand into his bosom, and when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous like snow. Then he said, "Put your hand into your bosom again." So he put his hand into his bosom again, and when he took it out of his bosom, behold, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. If they will not believe you or heed the witness of the first sign, they may believe the witness of the last sign. But if they will not believe even these two signs or heed what you say, then you shall take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground, and the water which you take from the Nile will become blood on the dry ground. Then Moses said to the Lord, "Please, Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither recently nor in time past, nor since you have spoken to your servant, for I am slow of speech and slow of tongue." The Lord said to him, "Who has made man's mouth? Or who makes him mute or deaf, or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now then go, and I, even I, will be with your mouth and teach you what you are to say." But he said, "Please, Lord, now send the message by whomever you will." Then the anger of the Lord burned against Moses, and he said, "Is there not your brother Aaron the Levite? I know that he speaks fluently, and moreover, behold, he is coming out to meet you. When he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. You are to speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I, even I, will be with your mouth and his mouth, and I will teach you what you are to do. Moreover, he shall speak for you to the people, and he will be as a mouth for you, and you will be as God to him. You shall take in your hand this staff, with which you shall perform the signs." Then Moses departed and returned to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, "Please let me go, that I may return to my brethren who are in Egypt, and see if they are still alive." And Jethro said to Moses, "Go in peace." Now the Lord said to Moses in Midian, "Go back to Egypt, for all the men who were seeking your life are dead." So Moses took his wife and his sons and mounted them on a donkey and returned to the land of Egypt. Moses also took the staff of God in his hand. The Lord said to Moses, "When you go back to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders which I have put in your power, but I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, 'Thus says the Lord, Israel is my son, my firstborn. So I said to you, let my son go, that he may serve me. But you have refused to let him go. Behold, I will kill your son, your firstborn.' Now it came about at the lodging place on the way that the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. Then Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and threw it at Moses' feet. And she said, 'You are indeed a bridegroom of blood to me.' So he let him alone. At that time she said, 'You are a bridegroom of blood because of the circumcision.' Now the Lord said to Aaron, 'Go to meet Moses in the wilderness.' So he went and met him at the mountain of God and kissed him. Moses told Aaron all the words of the Lord with which he had sent him and all the signs that he had commanded him to do. Then Moses and Aaron went and assembled all the elders of the sons of Israel, and Aaron spoke all the words which the Lord had spoken to Moses. He then performed the signs in the sight of the people, so the people believed, and when they heard that the Lord was concerned about the sons of Israel and that he had seen their affliction, then they bowed low and worshipped. As we dive into chapter 4, presumably we could think that Moses' staff could have really turned into anything at all. Is there any kind of special significance to the fact that God chose to transform this into a serpent to be the sign?
I'm going to make a very incredibly profound observation.
It's a good thing we're all sitting down.
Yeah.
Yeah, because if you weren't, you'd probably just fall right to the ground in awe. I think it might be that God turned the staff into a snake because it was already shaped like a snake, and changing it into any animal would be enough to impress the Israelites. So that's what I've always assumed. I could be wrong about that. It is interesting though that God could have changed it into an elephant or a shark or a bird or anything, but I guess I just assumed he changed it into a snake because it was already shaped like one.
Fair enough. I wrote this question. Yeah, maybe.
Greg thinks he wasted strapping on his seatbelt.
I did waste a good seatbelt use. I don't know, Joe. What about you?
I mean, I think that's fair. I don't know that I've ever really thought so much about why this animal instead of a different animal. I think what Eric's saying is certainly possible. In your question that you wrote, he could have turned it into a giraffe,
He
I guess.
could have.
That would have been also astounding. But yeah, I don't know. I hadn't really thought that much about it. So since you asked the question, why don't you drop a bomb on
I'm
us?
asking. No. I'm asking questions. I don't know. In my mind, was there a reason? I mean, presumably, God knew that this was going to be something that Moses feared. So was he wanting to strike a little bit of awe or reverence into Moses here with this? Moses fled from it. Maybe is there some connection that we should be seeing as the Bible uses serpents and snakes? I have questions. I don't have answers.
Sure. Well, certainly we can note it and keep it in mind for the future. And as we keep in mind these things, let's move on to our next point. As we talked about the book of Genesis and we commented kind of just on our overview, Greg, you had asked a very interesting question that I had never thought about before. I think, Eric, you had said the same thing, that you had never really contemplated that if we were trying to build a full theology proper of God, that possibly we could get pretty close with just the book of Genesis. But certainly there's some more stuff going on here in these chapters. What could you say in more detail about the person of God that's being revealed with what we're seeing here?
Well, just in Exodus 4, I think, well, for one, God, God can, of course, create things out of other things. He can create snakes out of, stabs. God also can cause physical impairments or physical ailments. Moses, his hand it became leprous. So, yeah, God can even cause things like that if he wants to. God can harden men's hearts, according to Exodus 4:21. He can do that to accomplish his own purposes. Basically, God can do about anything. He can. God has unlimited power, and he can do whatever he needs to do to get the job done. So I think it's maybe as simple as that for me.
Yeah, I think as I was reading this and thinking about this question that I asked, definitely the healing, turning sticks into snakes, his ability, the question, the interchange that he gets into with Moses, who's made man's mouth? Do you, it, what the idea that was prevalent a couple hundred years ago that God was this kind of a watchmaker, wound everything up and just kind of let it go, and that he's not really influencing or impacting things. Again, we could point to that nearly anywhere in the Bible, but developed there. Like, you think that I made your mouth, that I don't have the ability to now come through and strengthen it or make it function the way I want to. Just interesting, continual building upon the person and work of God that we've seen in Genesis.
As we're talking about the mouth, Greg, you brought up his mouth. Chapter 4, verse 10, and kind of what follows after that. The New American Standard translates it as Moses saying he's never been eloquent, that he's slow of speech and slow of tongue. I know that I've heard many people interpret that as Moses had a stutter. I've also heard others interpret this as saying, well, Moses has been away from Egypt for a long time, and he probably wasn't speaking Egyptian for maybe 4 decades at this point. I don't know if you guys ever studied any languages in high school. I did. That wasn't 4 decades ago for me, but I've lost an awful lot of my my fluency in being able to speak these languages that I haven't tried to speak for 2 decades. And so is he saying that he has a stutter? Is he saying, you're sending me to go speak to the basically the king of the Egyptian, nation, and I haven't spoken this language in 40 years. It seems like you should send somebody better. Or is there some other interpretation? How do you guys read this idea of being slow of tongue, slow of speech, not being eloquent?
Well, the latter interpretation that you gave, I think, was better. I honestly never really studied this much. One thing that we do know is that it sounded like whatever the problem was, God recognized it as a problem, and he used Aaron to remedy it, or at least that's what it sounds like. He talked about using Aaron to speak. So I guess it's not. I don't know what slow of speech really means. I mean, the second interpretation you gave seemed at least totally logical, and that could be what it means. So I'm just not totally sure.
Yeah. To this, if I remember right, the second option was he hadn't been in Egypt in a long time, and so he wasn't practiced in his Egyptian. I don't buy that one. Just by what he says, please, Lord, I've never been eloquent, or I have a note in my Bible says a man of words, neither recently nor in times past, nor since you've spoken to your servant. For I am slow of speech and slow of tongue, or again, a note here, heavy of speech, heavy of tongue. So I don't get, he's going, listen, Lord, not only am I not good now, but I've never been good at this. I just somehow doubt that he grew up as a daughter, or excuse me, as a son of in an Egyptian home and was never good at speaking Egyptian. Just seems odd. And so then could it be a stutter? I suppose it could be. I've never really, I'm not sure what it matters. What it appears to me is he's saying, listen, I'm not a great communicator. Could that have been a stutter? Suppose it could have been. I don't know. Could it be that like I'm not good at presenting my ideas? I work better in writing than I do in speech. I can sympathize with that. I'd much rather write than get up and talk. I think I'm better in writing. So I've always taken it that way.
I would think that, maybe a more middle position, if he's never been good at speaking, he's never been an orator, that's just never been his greatest form of communication. And then you add to that now you're asking me to be an orator in a language that I haven't spoken for 4 decades. That is possibly building objection upon objection and saying, I was never good at giving speeches or being the primary speaker. And now you want me to go do it in a language I haven't even spoken for 40 years. That's quite the ask. That brings us to the next question. What do we make about the anger that God expresses about this? Because, Eric, you mentioned that God saw that this was a problem and gave a solution, but it seems like his anger at least lends the possibility that God didn't actually see it as a problem. He's annoyed by Moses's request to not do this. And although he gives an alternative means of bringing it about, God seems, it explicitly says he's angry. So what do we make of God's anger?
Yeah, well, just to be clear, Moses is definitely coming up with excuses. That's why God was angry. He said, Lord, I can't do this. Lord, you're asking me to do this other thing? I can't do that either. Lord, you got the wrong guy, basically. And he's making up all these excuses. So I can see why God would be angry. He wasn't trusting God. He was basically focused on his own inabilities, which we so often do. So I can understand why God was angry with Moses. Moses was challenging God about everything that God was telling him to do. So he didn't believe he could do anything God said. And that really is an insult to God, because if God's asking you to do something, the implication is you can do it. It makes no sense for God to ask somebody to do something that he knows they can't do. That would be foolish. So by Moses challenging God about all these things, it was, I think, in a sense, insulting to God.
Yeah. No doubt, as I read the text, there is that challenge. As I read it, it really is about the faithfulness, right? So Moses presents a legitimate issue. Lord, you know me. You know I've never been good at talking. Can we just not do this? And God says, listen, I made your mouth. I can take care of this. Don't worry about it. And his response, instead of being, okay, I'll trust in you, it's, God, can you just reconsider? Can you please just send anybody else besides me? It just seems like a lack of faithfulness and what a great opportunity for Moses to learn here, I think, as a man who's going to play in a very, very important role in the life, in the story of God's redemption. Here, one-on-one with God, Moses is being corrected for unfaithfulness when he's going to have to show, and he will show, an extreme amount of faithfulness moving forward.
I think your points are all well taken, and I'll ask a follow-up question. Do you put any significance into the fact, I love, Greg, you were just kind of ending with, Moses says, well, send whoever you want. Well, God is trying to he's trying to send exactly who he wants. And Moses is giving all these excuses. I've heard some people say God has plan A and there is no plan B, and God always, we were just talking about how God is sovereign. He can bring about the ends, any ends that he wants. But God's plan was, at least expressly, that Moses would go and speak to Pharaoh. Because of Moses' complaints, God gets angry and provides an alternative pathway, which involves Aaron. But it says again that God is angry about this. if that was God's plan all along, why is he angry about it? And does this show us some flexibility in God's interacting with his creation and a willingness and a flexibility to use his sovereignty to achieve his ends, but it doesn't always go the way that God wants? And does that, I mean, do you think I'm reading too much into this, or do you have anything that you would add to that? This is a very significant passage to me, especially as we consider just how we see the Bible revealing between God's sovereignty, human agency, the freedom that people have. God's angry about Moses seemingly resisting the will of God and provides an alternative pathway to still get what God wants, but it's not something that God's pleased with. He's mad about what's going on here.
Yeah, if plan B, having Aaron come and play the role of prophet here, was always the plan, that sure isn't how the text presents it, right? So if we're going to hang our hat on, no, that's the way God always wanted it. He just had to get through this thing with Moses. That's not what my Bible says. And so, yeah, I think we're seeing here Moses being commanded to do something, Moses unfaithfully rebelling and kicking against that, God not happy with that, anger burned against Moses, yet graciously providing a way to still get it done. Now, again, did God always know? Yeah, I'm going to say God always knew, but was the plan Moses? Yes, the plan was.
Yeah, it's interesting because in verses 8 and 9, it even gives another example of this that even gives more possibilities. If they will not believe you or heed the witness of the first sign, then they may believe the witness of the last sign. But even if they will not believe even these two signs or heed what you say, then you shall take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground, and the water from which you take from the Nile will become blood on the dry ground. He gives them three options here. So he says, if option A doesn't work, well, then we'll go to option B. If option B doesn't work, we'll go to option C.
And we are talking about a crowd of people, hundreds of thousands of people, right? So,
yeah. Now, I'm trying to think about this. If God knows the whole future, which I do believe He does, I believe there's good reason to believe that. But we have to remember too that if you know everything, you can't talk to people that don't know everything the way that you probably want to. Like, if I know every single thing there is that's going to happen, I can't talk to people, in a way that is going to be consistent with that, because that person doesn't know everything. I was thinking about this a while back, and I thought, how difficult would it be to have a conversation with someone if you knew everything about them and you knew everything their future was going to entail? How could you even talk to someone in a situation like that? I think what you'd have to do is you'd have to do a little bit of condescending. And what I mean by that is, I'm not talking about being insulting or anything, but like, you have to take into account this person's limited knowledge and talk as if you are, if you're somewhat on their level, even though you transcend them and everything else. It's a lot to work out in a short conversation like this, but that's where my mind is going.
We all agree that God knows the future. He knows what people are going to do. He knows Pharaoh. He knows Moses, and yet he's angered by this. And anger is what is, even in a quote unquote condescension or whatever, the things that he's inspiring, what he was telling Moses to write down about this, is that this was upsetting to God and that this wasn't going the way that God ideally wanted it to go. And so it's a very curious passage, and I know that people approach it very differently. And so I would love to talk about this for hours and hours more, but for the sake of time, we'll move on. There's some more very interesting phrases, verse 21 and 22 back to back. Let's tackle verse 21 first. God says that He's going to harden Pharaoh's heart in order to bring these things about. That's a very controversial verse, been oft discussed. What would you guys add to that discussion as we're looking at this verse today?
The word harden in the Hebrew, it actually means to strengthen. And the way I look at this is that it wasn't that God was making a soft heart hard. It was that God was making a hard heart harder. And I think Exodus 3:19 proves that. God said, before He even hardened Pharaoh, he already said that Pharaoh's heart, it's going to take a lot to move this guy. It's going to take a lot to get this guy to do anything, because implying that his heart was already hard to begin with. However, I think God God needed to harden him further so that he could accomplish all of his plans. So I would say that harden, it basically means to increase the level of hardness that's already there. So harden doesn't mean you take a soft heart and you make it hard. It means you take a hard heart and make it harder. That's the way that I think the context makes that clear enough to me.
Yeah, I'd agree with that generally. I think what I don't see is I don't see that Pharaoh was going to be predisposed to being sympathetic towards them. Like if God didn't do this thing, Moses wasn't going to roll into town and be like, "Hey, let us go." And Pharaoh like, "Oh yeah, sure. Here, let me send you on your way with gifts of gold and silver." And so I guess I'm going to agree with you that this was God acting upon Pharaoh in such a way as to magnify the hardness of Pharaoh's heart so that God could be glorified to the degree that he would be based upon all of the miracles that he was going to show.
In the very next verse, God says Israel is his son, his firstborn. How do you understand this statement? What's the significance of what God's saying here?
It's in the context. It sounds like God would protect his firstborn, which is Israel, and kill Pharaoh's firstborn. So in other words, God was able to protect his son, but Pharaoh was not. So God was showing that he was far more powerful than Pharaoh. And I don't know for sure, I'm not saying this as a fact, but Pharaoh may have thought that he was some kind of God incarnate type person. I'm not totally sure about that. I think, I'm not sure if all the pharaohs believed that, or if only some of them did, or if that became a fad after a while. I don't know that with any certainty, but we know that there were gods in Egypt. I wonder if Pharaoh thought he was a god among the other gods, and it's like God was saying, "You think you're powerful? Well, guess what? I'm able to protect my firstborn from the plague, from my firstborn being Israel, but I'm going to kill your firstborn and all the others, and you can't stop me because you're not a god, and I am the God." So that's one way to look at it.
Yeah, I guess I'm jumping ahead, but we're asking questions of what's going to happen. I think it may be possible that we are going to see something of a power struggle between Pharaoh and his gods and God. And so I think this is the Lord declaring that I see Israel as my firstborn son, the son in whom I'm pleased with, and you're going to try to oppose my will, and my will is the good of my son, and I'm going to demonstrate that my will is going to vastly overpower yours in such a way that I'm going to draw my first son out and I'm going to kill your first son, leaving no question as to who's gods or who's in authority here.
I think those are all fair statements, and so let's move on again for the sake of time. I know that that's something we could probably discuss more. As Moses sets out in verses 24 to 26, the text tells us plainly that as he's getting on the way to begin obeying what God is just sending him out to do, that God meets him on the way and is about to put him to death. And then there's this, many people would say, somewhat bizarre description. What is going on here in verses 24 to 26?
Well, Moses may have failed to circumcise his son. In Exodus 2:22, it says Moses had a son. And this would explain why Zipporah circumcised him and threw the foreskin at Moses' feet. Remember earlier, God required all the male descendants of Abraham to be circumcised, as back in Genesis 17:10, and failure to do so would result in being cut off from his people, Genesis 17:14 says. So it sounds like God really expected all the Israelite males to be circumcised with no exceptions. And there was punishment if they didn't. And it would be unthinkable for God to appoint a man to lead the Israelites who was not even obeying God himself. If Moses was being disobedient, that would be even a bigger deal as the leader of Israel. So the threat, God's threat here, brought about the intended repentance because Zipporah did circumcise her son.
Yeah, again, I'm going to fall pretty much in line. It seems like God expected Moses to have enough knowledge of the covenant that he would have practiced circumcision. This is another instance where I go, man, there's so much going on behind this story that we aren't told. Like, so here comes God coming to kill Moses for not doing this, and Zipporah just knows, like, oh, hey, I better go grab a knife and cut off the foreskin of my son. Like, there's just a whole lot of things going on behind this story that I would love to hear the details of. Like, how did you know? Like, why was that what you jumped to? Like,
do you think that suggests that they were intentionally disobeying something that they knew that they should have done? I mean, if she immediately knows the remedy, one at least conclusion could be, well, they knew they should have done this and they hadn't done it, and so here comes judgment, and it immediately brings them to conviction. Oh yeah, we should do that thing, and
like
we should
right
do it
now.
with haste.
I'm sure that's what happened.
That would be my interpretation for sure.
Yeah, so I mean, deliberate disobedience against the Lord. We see the swiftness of judgment. It is very interesting. I mean, God is commissioning him for this purpose, and then immediately upon his setting out, almost puts him to death. And so it is a strange passage. I remember reading through this the first time. I had mentioned to you guys last time that this book really grabbed my attention. I remember writing about that in like my prayer journal. I'm like, what is going on here? And I eventually settled in exactly what you guys are saying. So like you, Greg, I fall very much in line with how Eric described it, and I appreciate his description. My first couple times reading through this, I had no idea what was going on, and it was a question that persisted for quite a bit of time. And oddly enough, you don't hear a lot of sermon series on Exodus chapter 4, verses 24 to 26. It's not a common,
it's my life
common
verse.
Passage. At least not in verses that I've.
I totally would have guessed that, Eric. Totally would have guessed that.
Oh boy! All right. Well, our last question for our show sheet today, verses 30 to 31, begins this. Greg, the way you put it, an interesting cycle that will basically define the rest of Israel's future history. So this is the first kind of high point in that cycle, and we don't see a low point yet. So how, you wrote this question. So what thoughts do you have about this? And then we'll turn it over to Eric to get the kind of the last word for today.
Yeah, I just, in my mind, as I read 27 through 31, this is the first instance where we see God doing great and amazing things, and all of Israel going, yay, that's awesome. Yes, we're going to fall down. We're going to worship. We're going to commit ourselves to the Lord. Now, we know it won't take long. We'll probably be talking about it next time. That faithfulness is going to drop off, and they're not going to be responding. And so it's just, for me, it's just an interesting data point in the history of this people, and probably as a people, the first one. So wanted to point that out.
Yeah, I don't think it's surprising that Israel believed and worshiped God at this point after witnessing the miracles and hearing about God's concern for them. Actually, they were in a desperate situation, and they had been asking God to deliver them for some time. So they shouldn't have been surprised that God heard them and was willing to deliver them. That's what they had been praying for.
It's just interesting how short of a time it lasts.
Oh, yeah, for sure. No, I agree with what you said. Yeah. I just think that, when we pray and ask God for stuff, we shouldn't be surprised when he does it. It's like, that's kind of the way it should go, or at least, if our heart is right and we're asking for valid things.
Well, guys, I appreciate your perspective on these things. I know there is much more that could be said, but we've kind of reached the end of our allotted time for this conversation today. If you're still watching this and you have thoughts, we'd love to hear your comments in the comment section below. I know that we've somewhat restrained ourselves, but was there anything that you would like to discuss that we haven't brought up? We'd love to hear that. Or if you have further thoughts on the things that we did discuss, again, the comment section is a great place for you to sound off and let us know what you think about Exodus 3 and 4. If you're still watching the video and you enjoyed it, consider clicking that thumbs up button. If you enjoy conversations like this and you haven't yet subscribed, consider subscribing as well, because as you may have envisioned, we have many, many more conversations to go as we continue in this biblical theology project, and we'd love for you to go along with us. But even if you don't go along with us, at least the three of us will plan to continue. And so until next time, get equipped, obey your King, and glorify your God.
Yeah, quit doing that, Greg.